In this lecture, we're going to be considering Daoism a bit further, and also toward the end, the way that Daoism, somewhat ironically, made it easier for Buddhism to gain a foothold in China. In the last lecture, we talked quite a bit about Wu Wei, the Taoist ideal of non-assertive action. In this lecture, I'm going to begin by talking about a more positive term, really to discuss the same sort of thing, and this is the term Ziran. Ziran is translated sometimes as spontaneity, but it's important to keep in mind that what's spontaneous is the action of your own nature. It's sometimes been translated with the kind of convoluted term self-so-ness. In other words, you're just as you are. And that's the idea of naturalness that the Taoists encourage. People should be natural in their behavior with each other rather than imagining certain kinds of things that ought to take place. The idea of Ziran is a part and parcel of the same idea as Wu Wei. What one wants to do is not assert, but instead mirror one's world. If one mirrors one's world without preconceptions, then one is going to operate in it much more effectively, and certainly in a way that sustains one's vitality. Maybe the opposite of being Ziran is a situation when you're planning to bring up a topic that you know is going to be at least a little bit troublesome between you and someone else. Say a situation where a boyfriend and girlfriend are breaking up, or you want to ask your boss for a raise, some kind of altercation that you're anticipating. It's so easy in our minds to go through all the motions where you think, well, if I say this, he'll say that. If I say this, she'll say that. You maybe have scripts going on or even whole plays going on in your mind before you ever get to the situation. Sometimes people do think that it's helpful to have in mind exactly what they're going to say. But again, what they aren't doing in that situation is responding to the situation. Suppose you have a speech lined up because you do want to ask for a raise. You come in, your boss is in some distraught frame of mind because something bad has happened. Do you go through with your speech? Well, a Taoist would say, if you go through with your speech without responding, there's something really missing in your reaction. You're not taking account of the objective situation. You're not taking account of the situation at all. But again, you're just kind of imposing your agenda on the world as you encounter it. And this is really contrary to allowing your true nature to respond. You're better off, the Taoists would say, to just allow your nature to express itself. The more you can avoid planning in advance what it is you're going to say, the more you can avoid planning in advance what you think the other person is going to say, then the more you can actually listen and negotiate. The idea of Ziran comes through in many of the stories that Zhuangzi tells. And one of the stories that I think is particularly entertaining as well as revelatory is a story he tells about him and his mentor, Hui Shi, walking together and stopping on a bridge. Hui Shi was a logician. He was a philosopher a little bit older than Zhuangzi, and actually really Zhuangzi's favorite sparring partner and good friend. Their philosophies end up being rather different. Hui Shi was very concerned about using words precisely and logical paradoxes that resulted from using words in certain kinds of locutions that we do every day. Like, is a white horse a horse, or is a white horse a separate category? Questions of categories were really pretty exciting to Hui Shi. You can imagine that Zhuangzi didn't really see the world that way. In fact, I'm kind of reminded of what I fantasize the conversations between Plato and Aristotle must have been like. I mean, since Plato was Aristotle's teacher, they must have had lots of conversations, but they disagreed on some really fundamental things. And presumably they got along well enough to maintain this teacher-student relationship. Perhaps this is a kind of similar situation here. So here's Zhuangzi's story. Zhuangzi and Hui Shi were strolling along the dam of the Hao River when Zhuangzi said, "See how the minnows come out and dart around where they please? That's what fish really enjoy." Hui Shi said, "You're not a fish. How do you know what fish enjoy?" Zhuangzi said, "You're not I, so how do you know I don't know what fish enjoy?" Hui Shi said, "I'm not you, so I certainly don't know what you know. On the other hand, you're certainly not a fish, so that still proves you don't know what fish enjoy." Zhuangzi said, "Let's go back to your original question, please. You asked me how I know what fish enjoy. So you already knew I knew it when you asked the question. I know it by standing here beside the how." Now, one of the things that is suggested by that rather odd story is that the point of view that people come to a situation with has a lot to do with the way they see it. Zhuangzi is in a state of mind to just enjoy his environment. He's happy to see fish darting about. The scene seems beautiful, and he expresses this by talking about how it's wonderful to see the minnows really enjoying themselves. Huishir's point of view, somewhat typical for his kind of philosophy, is to be discriminating in his use of categories. He's a little bit like someone who might say, well, let's not be too hasty about that. You can't really say that you know what the fish enjoy. After all, you're not a fish. It reminds me a little bit of contemporary thinkers who sometimes say, well, you don't really know if animals have emotions. I mean, you're not one of those animals, so you can't really tell whether they're the same things that we experience or not. Maybe their behavior is just similar to ours. Descartes actually had a view like that. He thought that, in a sense, because mind and body came together in us in a unique way because we have an immortal soul, that in a way we can talk about animals as having bodies kind of similar to ours, but in a way they're kind of more like machines. They don't have this natural light of reason that God gives us. So since he talks about animals as a bit like machines, I'd say, yeah, this kind of attitude is something that is widespread. I don't think Huishir is quite going that far. He's just questioning Zhuangzi's ability to really say with any authority what the world of the fishes are. Zhuangzi, feeling himself one with the whole scene, takes his assertion to be a perfectly reasonable thing to say. So what they affirm in this case is relative to their standpoint, one being a person who's focusing on his connection with everything, the other, someone who's being rather cautious in his use of categories. There's a sense here that what's being denied is objective knowledge in the Western sense of outside of any perspective. What they both say makes a certain amount of sense, but you have to understand what the perspective is. Nevertheless, there's a real joke in the last line, because Zhuangzi, after going back and forth a bit, and it's pretty obvious that this is kind of a game. I mean, it's not a really serious, ponderous dispute. It's the way they get along all the time. It's kind of a philosophical game, if you will, but that's what they really enjoy doing. In the last line, Zhuangzi says, well, now wait a minute. Didn't you ask me how I know? And isn't in that sentence there a notion of my knowing this? So if you ask me how I know, I must have known it, even according to you. Now, obviously, this would go nowhere in terms of actually persuading Huishir, but he's kind of using Huishir's own technique of analyzing concepts or analyzing the way sentences are structured in order to figure out what it is that's actually being asserted. So he's saying, yeah, well, if you say to me, how do you know, you're already implying that you know. And I'm telling you how I know. I know it by just being here looking at the fish. Again, it's one of these rather humorous stories in Zhuangzi. But a lot is being suggested, even though it seems to be really pretty funny. Another fairly funny story from Zhuangzi is the following. Once Zhuangzhou dreamt that he was a butterfly flittering and fluttering about, happy with himself and doing as he pleased. He didn't know he was Zhuangzhou. Suddenly he woke up, and there he was, solid and unmistakable Zhuangzhou. But he didn't know if he was Zhuangzhou, who had just dreamt he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming he was Zhuangzhou. Now this contrasts again with a Cartesian vision of things. You might recall that Descartes thought dreaming was a real reason to be a little dubious of our beliefs about anything, since after all, our senses seem to take in the world, but when we're asleep and dreaming, we think we're taking in the world too. So it's not really that obvious how we distinguish dreaming and waking. And when we wake up, we think that all those experiences we had dreaming were just illusions. How can we tell the difference? Well, in this case, there's no attempt to privilege one or the other. The idea is, yes, from this point of view, this seems to be the case. From this point of view, this seems to be the case, but you really can't tell. there's, I think, implicitly here a notion that categories, again, have to be flexible to the situation. And it's kind of a joke, as many of Zhuangzi's stories are. I mean, it is kind of funny to think of someone waking up after dreaming being a butterfly, wondering, am I a butterfly dreaming on me, or the other way around? I mean, it's funny, but he's also suggesting that too often we have an idea that one kind of thing is the right way to do things, another kind of thing is the wrong way, and we are so stuck in these categories that we've lost touch with any kind of experience. The Taoist conception of de, again the same word we talked about in connection with Confucius, in this case means power. I mean, that is basically a common translation of de. And power has to do with nature generally. It's focused on in two different ways. One is on our own power being the kind of being that we are. This is a kind of usage a little bit like what happens when we talk in English about being at the height of one's powers. Well, what are one's powers? Depends on who you are. But nevertheless, being at the height of one's powers means whatever those powers are, you're using them in a really full way. So de, the idea of power, can mean the nature of any kind of thing or person. On the other hand, de, power, can also refer to this kind of power that comes about as a result of attuning oneself with the environment, using the forces from the environment in order to achieve your goals, or allowing your goals to become flexible given the situation. It's really a mistake if you're stuck in traffic to persist in your goal of doing a certain number of things at a certain time if that's not going to happen. And the Taoists would say this is where you ought to be flexible with your goals. It isn't clear that all Taoists think that goals are completely flexible. I mean, that you can do without them in any serious way. It may be that you still need to have them, but they still have to be treated as provisional. It's sort of like a map. In a way, I think that's a good way of understanding what the Taoists are talking about generally when they're suspicious of categories, preconceptions, language. All of these things are maps that are useful to us for certain purposes, but sometimes they're not useful. If you have a map, I frequently am in this difficulty. I get a rental car and I get a map from the rental car company. Well, it shows certain main highways. But if I want to go to a street that isn't on this map, this isn't really going to help me very much. And the Taoists are saying a lot of times we're operating with tools that are really sometimes too crude for what we're trying to do, tools that really have too much importance to us, when what we're really concerned with is the world itself. Speaking of power in connection with attuning oneself with the environment as a whole, Zhuangzi tells a really wonderful story about Cook Ding. It's a rather long passage, and I'll only read some of it, but I think this will give you the general idea of the story. Cook Ding was cutting up an ox for Lord Huanhui. At every touch of his hand, every heave of his shoulder, every move of his feet, every thrust of his knee, zip-zoop, he slithered the knife along with a zing, and all was in perfect rhythm, as though he were performing the dance of the mulberry grove or keeping time to the Qingzhou music. "Ah, this is marvelous," said Lord Huanhui. "Imagine skill reaching such heights." Cook Ding laid down his knife and replied, "What I care about the way, which goes beyond skill. A good cook changes his knife once a year because he cuts. A mediocre cook changes his knife once a month because he hacks. I've had this knife of mine for 19 years, and I've cut up thousands of oxen with it, and yet the blade is as good as though it had just come from the grindstone. There are spaces between the joints, and the blade of the knife really has no thickness. If you insert what has no thickness into such spaces, then there's plenty of room. That is why after 19 years, the blade of my knife is still as good as when it first came from the grindstone." "Excellent," said Lord Huanhui. "I have heard the words of Cook Ding and learned how to care for life." A number of things could be noted in that story. One of them is that it's rather odd in a stratified society for a duke to be learning things from his cook. But that's exactly the kind of story that Zhuangzi likes to tell. It isn't necessarily people's external position that tells you what authority they have. And that's something that he thinks is, again, one of those kind of categorical ideas that we have before we enter a situation that often misleads us. Also, Cook Ding, in being a butcher in this case, is actually doing something that almost seems like a dance. It's choreographed. This is like a ritual performance. And this is one of the things that makes the Duke just stunned by how beautiful this all is. And I think Zhuangzi would recognize that this is not a context where most people would expect to be seeing something graceful and beautiful. Butchering is not really one of those categories where you usually talk in these terms. And so when the cook starts talking with him about it, what he says is, it's not so much a question of skill, it's my concern being with the way here being the Tao. He's come to become one with the whole situation, the flow of things. Sometimes if you see somebody do something that they've done many, many times before, it is extremely impressive to see how naturally things happen. I think of playing an instrument. Someone who has mastered an instrument. Their fingers, if it's a kind of instrument that involves fingering, can work wonderfully, and it just does seem marvelous, particularly if you're not familiar with it, or someone who aspires to this ability. To just see the comfort that some people's hands have in playing an instrument, or to see the smoothness with which someone plays a certain role in the sport that they're very accustomed to. It's a kind of achievement, but it doesn't come from their being particularly self-conscious. In fact, a lot comes from their being not self-conscious. As long as one is self-conscious, the self-consciousness is interfering with this oneness with the way. And so what Cook Ding is focusing on is the fact that through all this experience, he's come to recognize a way of doing things that now is consistent with the way. Then he goes on to talk about how what he's really doing is putting something with no width into the little crevices between the joints. Now, I think in terms of, just the practicality of the situation, that seems kind of far-fetched. But what he's saying is that many times, I think, externally to an activity, it seems that hitting the right mark isn't going to be something obvious. But he's saying, no, it comes with a knowledge of the structure of the thing. Actually, I'm just following the course of nature here. I could hack. I mean, again, this is kind of a symbol for the sort of imposing one's agenda on something, regardless of what presents itself to you. But instead of that, I just follow the natural lines. And that makes things work well for me. That makes my tools work well for me. All of this is a kind of summation, I think, of the Taoist position. That what you really want to do, whatever your activity, is to attune yourself with the Tao. Then you don't have to force any issue. Attunement with the Tao is also a means that Taoists have used to come to terms with death. As I mentioned, of course, there were lots of medicinal formulas that people tried as well. People did think the idea of personal immortality wouldn't be a bad thing, particularly if it helped them. But in general, the idea of dealing with death, of course, is a problem for people throughout the world. And the Taoist conception of it is it's important to see yourself as part of the flow of nature. So the aging process itself becomes something that is just part of this beautiful sweep of nature. At one point, Zhuangzi remarks on how the power of the world is making him all crookedy, and he's kind of startled and amazed by that. Presents this as something that is, just another one of these miraculous transformations of things. Because of this, it's really important, he thinks, to just attend to the fact that at every moment, nature is moving and we're moving along with it. Resenting the idea of death is really, again, trying to impose your will on the scheme of things and trying to act as though you could assert your will against nature. But in fact, if we recognize ourselves as part of nature, this makes our own story make sense in the story of the whole. Once one does this, it becomes easier to think less about the past and less about the future, and to focus instead on the present. There's a kind of present orientation in Daoism, the kind of focus that someone has to have in order to perform a skill well. Concentration, which doesn't necessarily mean calculating a lot. It probably means something other than that. But clear, focused concentration is, and indeed, a kind of mystical goal as well as a goal for being practically effective. So what the Taoists do in this respect is suggest that we overcome a kind of narrow sense of ourselves and our agendas by attuning ourselves to the world and its flow altogether. We see our own dissolution as just part of nature, and we learn to make peace with that. Now, if that sounded a little bit, in some respects, like a vision that we've talked about before in connection with Buddhism, it did to some Chinese too. When Buddhism entered China, it seemed extremely foreign. But the Taoists, in a way, facilitated the acceptance of some Buddhist ideas, and these Buddhist ideas gradually gained a foothold in China. Just to point out, though, how much cultural dissonance there was, I'm going to read a passage from Francis Cook, who is describing the difference between the way the Chinese tended to portray the Buddha or an enlightened person and Indian depictions. The difference between this view, Chinese view, of the sage and that of the Indian Buddhists can be seen quite clearly when we compare the two as portrayed in their respective traditions. The Indian figure is dressed in a manner befitting royalty, and royalty they are, though not a profane royalty. Jewels hang from the neck, ears, arms, and legs. The hair is elaborately arranged, and he wears a robe, the robes of a prince. The pose is especially remarkable. The figure often sits cross-legged in yogic meditation, regal, aloof, with eyes half closed, the faint smile on the lips betraying the unspeakable bliss of one who has found a peace far removed from the dust and turmoil of the earthly arena. In contrast, the Chinese saint is frequently rather fat, jovial, and totally relaxed. He is barefooted, and his hair and clothes, more like rags, are in negligent disarray. He obviously still enjoys plum wine and a good meal. There is nothing of the renunciate about him. He travels freely from village to village, dispensing goodies from his bags to the children who tease him and adore him, never for a moment losing the happy, silly grin of a man who knows who he is. Nobody. And where he is. Nowhere. The emancipated individual is not superhuman or royal, like the Indian Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. He would never walk on water or levitate. And who wants to sit forever in yogic withdrawal when one can play games with the village urchins? They delight in the ordinary, the simple and the humble. Chopping wood and carrying water, therein lies the wonderful way. So Cook's suggestion here is that there's a real gap stylistically between the notion of Buddha and enlightenment that came from India and what developed in China. And I think even here, if you think about the Taoists, there's already a kind of base in China for this kind of interpretation. The Taoists, as you might have noticed from the Zhuangzi text, frequently enjoy the idea that somebody who doesn't have a very important position in society might nevertheless speak wisdom. And in fact, if you observe art where Taoists are depicted, a lot of times they're really rather unkempt. Sometimes their shirts will be open. Really something that the Confucian, who is concerned with dignity and maintaining ritual comportment at all times, would find absolutely intolerable. Well, in a way the Buddha, the enlightened one, comes to be portrayed in Chinese art tends to be a little bit more like that. Someone who is not really concerned with appearances on the outside or royalty or what other people expect, but is much more concerned with interaction. But there are a number of reasons why Buddhism at first didn't appeal to the Chinese, or didn't appeal to many of them. One, first of all, is just that it's a foreign religion. And that in itself would create a certain amount of suspicion. A second reason why Buddhism didn't necessarily seem a very agreeable religion at first to many was that it encouraged monasteries and nunneries. The idea of the religious life, particularly in early Buddhism, which later came to be called, or that tradition came to be called Theravada, struck many Chinese as not very responsible. If you keep in mind that the notion of ethical responsibility had much to do with your relations to others, in the Confucian tradition in particularly, but in Chinese thought generally, the idea of just packing off and moving to a monastery didn't seem like a very responsible thing to do at all. You're kind of leaving your family in the lurch. And keep in mind that it was an extended family, too. So this would be at any point, whether or not you're talking about having children. Also, the idea of having children seemed the appropriate thing to do to continue the family. This notion of family also prevented many Chinese from seeing much in Buddhism at first, because Buddhism has this notion of reincarnation. In the Chinese tradition, on the other hand, it was viewed as really important to offer sacrifices to the ancestors. Well, if you believe in reincarnation, what's the status of the ancestors? This just didn't add up. So there were a lot of things going against Buddhism when it first entered China. However, and this is one of the ways that it becomes more palatable, Taoist terminology actually helped to make the transition. Buddhist texts arrived in China, and at first people didn't know exactly what to make of them. But there were some terms that seemed somewhat familiar if you consider ideas in Daoism. So, for example, the idea of nirvana, cessation of craving. Well, some people saw this as being not entirely dissimilar from Wu Wei. I mean, if Wu Wei is non-assertive action, if you're going to not assert yourself, you've kind of given up craving of a certain sort. There's kind of a match, but it's not a very perfect match. Similarly, the idea of the Tao was used to characterize the notion of interdependent arising. This Buddhist idea of interdependent arising, again, is the idea that there is no separate self or separate thing, but everything comes about all together. Everything is interconnected. So all things, all people are relative realities. Well, the Tao is a notion that involves a sense that everything is interconnected. The qi flows among various beings. This seemed to have some resonance with the idea of the flow of cause and effect, causing one thing to happen and then another, and causing us to imagine things to be more stable than they are, because sometimes these aren't very perceptible. There's a kind of match, but it wasn't a perfect match. This wasn't a very accurate way of rendering Chinese texts. I think it's useful here to keep in mind the tendency that we all have to try to understand something unfamiliar in terms of what's familiar. And certainly in the whole enterprise that we're talking about in this course of making any kind of comparisons, it's really important to keep in mind that sometimes the comparisons we make already are assuming a lot of our worldview, and they might be leaving out some aspects of it as well. But I think that the history of Chinese Buddhism also suggests that as a starting point, maybe this isn't such a bad thing. It's just very important to correct for omissions. So in effect, this is what happened. Gradually, Buddhist texts started to have better translations, or the discrepancies between the idea of Tao and nirvana became noticed by scholars. So more efforts were made to articulate this in a way that was more true to the spirit of Buddhism in the first place. And hopefully, as we try to compare our worldview to the worldview of others, we'll have the same sort of experience. At first, we notice similarities that are very obvious to us. Maybe after that, we notice some dissimilarities. And maybe it takes a few more steps beyond that to get to a happy medium. In the next lecture, we'll be saying more about the way in which Buddhism came to take on particularly Chinese characteristics. Thank you.